Hello and welcome to Craftwork, a podcast by writers for writers.
Craftwork is recorded in Fredericton, New Brunswick, on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqiyik, the people of the Wolastoq River. I'm Miriam Riche.
And I'm Mike Thorne, we'll be your co-hosts. The music for this podcast is composed and recorded by Randy Nickel Schroeder.
Nour Abi-Nakhoul is a writer and editor based in Montreal. She is the editor-in-chief of the award-winning quarterly Maisonneuve magazine. Her short fiction has appeared in Hazlitt and The Walrus. Her debut novel, Supplication, was released by Penguin Random House in 2024. Thank you so much, Nour, for being on our podcast today. We're really excited to talk to you. We both really loved Supplication. I really like literary horror, and it was just scratched an itch for me, so I really genuinely enjoyed it a lot.
Thanks so much for having me and for your enthusiasm for Supplication.
First question, pretty easy. What are you working on now, and how is it going?
I'm working on a few different projects right now. They're all extremely dissimilar from Supplication. One novel I'm working on that I'm almost done. I just finished a first manuscript for it. It needs a lot more work, so I'm fine-tuning it a bit. It is a kind of historical novel that is set in the 1910s loosely in kind of London, Paris, and then Morocco as well. It's based on historical events kind of, but I've fictionalized it obviously. It's kind of a queer love story between these two men who were actual historical figures, very minor historical figures that lived during this time. And in the novel they have this affair that kind of stretches through London, Paris, and Morocco. And there's a bit of tragedy in there. There's a bit of, the bohemian underground scene, and it kind of goes into the drug criminalization of the time, because it's taking place during a time when historically drugs were starting to be criminalized for the first time. So prior to the mid-1910s, drugs were very accessible. People could kind of buy them at neighborhood pharmacies, and drug use was going kind of unchecked. During this time, there was these kind of underground bohemian parties that were being thrown where people would smoke opium and do cocaine. And it was this really elaborate arrangements. And obviously it was during World War I for a lot of this. So it was kind of this debauchery that was going on at this time, as the media referred to it. And the police and the state started to kind of crack down on it after that. And there were these really crazy court trials where different queer people were kind of put on trial for their participation in these parties, because there was also cross-dressing and, homosexuality going on at these parties. So yeah, the novel takes place during this time of extreme tension in regards to drug use and also queerness. But I'm fictionalizing a lot of the history. But yeah, that's kind of the main project I'm working on right now.
That sounds fascinating. There is a certain energy and velocity to your writing. I can just imagine your style. It sounds very different from Supplication, but I can imagine your style bringing a lot to that, which I guess leads into one of the questions I had written down for you. We did a fairly recent interview with Paula Ashe, who wrote this collection called We Are Here to Hurt Each Other, which is fantastic. And we talked with Paula about different forms of movement in narrative fiction, how some novels and stories might have minimal plot incident, but a lot of psychological momentum or change. And that's true, of course, of lots of modernist fiction. And I'd say also a lot of Gothic and horror fiction plays with this convention, like Poe, Kathy Koja. Those two stood out as two examples in my mind. So I guess I wanted to put the same question to you. It's kind of a broad question, but how do you think about movement as a writer?
That's kind of an interesting framework. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, especially the rise of, how people are talking about so-called plotless fiction. And, it's a bit pejorative describing novels where nothing happens. But, I've never really understood that kind of discourse, because looking at a lot of the novels that they're talking about, it does feel like a lot happens. Just, I guess, as you said, not more on the psychological or emotional level. I feel like for my book, if you're looking at it in terms of the events that are taking place in the novel, there's not really a lot that happens. There's not a lot of characters, the ones that have no names or real identities. There's only a few places that the book takes place in, and they're really sparse environments usually. So, from one perspective, nothing really happens, but I do feel like a lot happens in the book, like psychologically for the protagonist, where she's moving through these really intensive psychological and emotional states and doing this kind of identity work throughout the whole book. So yeah, I'd say that is kind of where the main movement of the novel happens, like a lot of internal and a lot of really cyclical kind of internal movements where she's really circling around the same ideas over and over again in a really repetitive way throughout the whole book.
I read an interview with you wherein you named Clarice Lispector and Ingeborg Bachmann as influences on your writing, on Supplication in particular. You had cited their work as being similarly, quote, invested in reflecting the inner workings of their narrator's consciousness, but without trying to filter that consciousness to make it more intelligible to the reader. Unquote. First off, Supplication, I found it to be entrancingly opaque. When you were writing it, did you have to resist this exposition and explanation, or did you remove scaffolding as you went along to maintain the desired level of disorientation, or did the voice just come to you more or less as we see it on the page?
I think with Supplication, like there was a really singular intention with it where I didn't really want to have a lot of explication as to like, what was so-called objectively going on throughout the book. And I wanted to stay really immersed within how the protagonist in her really paranoid frame of mind was seeing stuff. There were times when I was writing where I maybe wanted to put some scaffolding in there or maybe wanted to clarify things or would think readers might find this really challenging and readers might not be able to really grasp what's going on here. So I did kind of have to resist it as I went along. But the voice was really there with me from the beginning. Like the style of the protagonist's mind as she's moving through this world was really like the central part of the book and the part that was the impetus for the whole thing to unfold.
Both in physical and psychological terms, the book does engage with a lot of confinement, and the narrator seems often to be guided by an abstract but overpowering force, which I found very interesting, how you were engaging with that, in some ways using the language of genre. I'm always curious how writers think about agency, particularly in this book. I was really interested to hear how you thought about this idea of agency while working on Supplication.
I'd say that agency is like one of the primary concerns of the character through the book. I think she has this really complicated and like a bit of a contradictory relationship to agency where she rejects it a lot of the time and wants to be kind of overpowered by this thing that's greater than her to kind of guide her movement so that she doesn't have to form an identity and she doesn't have to take positions on things and she can just be kind of thrust through the world using this force that's greater than her. And that is a desire that people have all the time. It's a very human desire to want some kind of greater framework to guide you so you don't have to be doing like really complicated decision making all the time. And it's not possible for anyone to do that in any moment. We do need to have these greater systems or greater things that can kind of do that work for us. But she is like really desperately looking for something like that for herself. But at the same time, she is also at times wanting to have agency and wanting to have freedom. And she's kind of trapped in this back and forth place where she wants something greater than her to guide her. And then she's also kind of disgusted by that and repels that from herself. So she's kind of stuck in the middle there, which is part of why she's really circling around the same ideas over and over again throughout the book and doesn't really go anywhere and doesn't really develop throughout the novel.
You had said somewhere, maybe I, as a writer, can't tell my protagonist what to do next. She has to make that choice for herself. It's something that I can't impose on her. I'm always more on a global level curious with how writers conceive of character. I know for myself when I write fiction, it has to be partly me, but partly maybe certain tics or moral quandaries that I have about other people. I'm just wondering, in addition to this quote of yours, is there a sense that the character at a certain point becomes their own person and can make their own decisions? It's almost as if an umbilical cord is cut and it becomes its own person. So
yeah, totally. I do feel like after spending a lot of time with a character, they do kind of develop a life of their own. And I feel like to a certain extent, as a writer, you do have to be thinking of your characters as actual persons and not as just kind of tools that you're working with, and especially for something like Supplication, where writing it, I was really immersed in the character's frame of mind, and this voice of hers was really with me from the beginning and was the impetus of the book, as I said earlier, that she really developed this kind of life of her own as I was working with her. Yeah, and that's part of what influenced me at the end to leave it a bit open-ended and a bit ambiguous and just not impose any decisions on her at the end and leave it open-ended for her to be able to make her own choice after the ending of the book. So I guess I was thinking of it as the novel and her trajectory continuing after the book ends, just like in her own world and not for me to impose it on her.
Did you ever have some fear going into, because in my first novel, I deliberately kind of obfuscated and ambiguated as much as I could. And I found some readers were very adversarial toward that. Like there was a kind of, did you run into any of that? Was there, because I remember I was having some anxiety, like, am I going too far with ambiguating? Am I going too far with sort of, I don't know, effacing some of these conventions that I find less interesting? Was that ever an anxiety for you when you're writing a book? Do you have to shut out this hypothetical reader? Because I find for me, it can be an obstruction sometimes.
I did kind of have to shut it out a little bit. Obviously, I knew as I was writing it that it was going to be a challenging book for people to read and that people were going to have strong reactions to it. And, I've seen in the last 6 months or so since the book has been out, there has been that kind of adversarial reaction to it from some readers. But when I was writing, I wasn't really thinking of that so much. I wasn't trying to make it a super accessible book, and I wasn't really thinking of how people were going to be reacting to it. It's really difficult to write while thinking of that. It's not very productive for the writing space for me.
Oh, totally. Yeah. No, I agree with you in theory. In practice, it's kind of hard to turn off, though, sometimes. Do you find that, or are you just
Yeah, I feel that now it's a lot harder to turn off. At first, when I was writing Supplication, it was I hadn't written any books before. I didn't even really have very much published. So it was kind of easier for me to shut that out in a way. But now, after having a book come out and seeing, how people react to it and the surprising things that they pick up on or are challenged by, it's a lot harder to turn that off. And as I've been writing this other project I've been working on, I've been kind of thinking of the reader's reaction a lot more and having to sort of push that away and be I cannot think of this right now. That is for later.
You do a really good job of handling a lot of long, complex sentence structures in the novel, but it's done in a very deliberate way. The form is reflecting the content in intelligent and I think really rewarding ways. I was curious how you arrived at the book's rhythm. Was that something that you kind of found through exploratory writing, something you kind of conceived of in advance, or maybe honed over multiple drafts, maybe a combination of those things?
Yeah, it was really, that style was really there with me from the beginning, and that was kind of a facet of the voice of this character that came to me. There are a lot of long sentences. There's a lot of rhythmic kind of repetition and a lot of fragments that are repeated throughout the book. And it's a really kind of obsessive and paranoid way of writing that I was trying to kind of mirror the headspace of a character that was in this very obsessive, very neurotic and kind of paranoid state of mind and how they would be thinking. That's kind of where the rhythm of the book came from.
I get excited when I hear of people who kind of marry form with content, if you know what I mean, to try to emulate a state of mind through a specific writing style. I do think you do that really effectively, as you just touched on, or Mike just touched on as well. You do use repetition to great effect to achieve this kind of obsession or paranoia. The device often appears in moments when the protagonist is experiencing a sort of religious trance. So, for example, from Supplication, I really liked this passage, quote, "With the plastic mechanism in my grip, I curved my fingers, pulling against the trigger, pulling against the lever that opens the door to the chalice, that opens the door that fills the chalice, that opens the door and lets the ancient and fragile things rush out into the world," unquote. I read somewhere that you had selected the title Supplication for its religious connotations, and so maybe you just answered this, but did you model these sort of quote-unquote chanting passages off of other texts that you read, or did it just come to you organically, this style of writing?
Yeah, it wasn't really modeled after religious texts. I mean, there's a lot of, I feel like, religious imagery in the book, and even in the passage you just read, like this idea of the chalice is like a very religious thing as well. And so there's like some symbolism throughout the book that is religious, but the style itself, I guess there's like a meditative quality to the obsessiveness of it, which is like a bit, yeah, I guess there's like some religiousness there. But the style wasn't meant to be religious.
You do have this like very amazing knack for writing in a kind of defamiliarizing point of view. I just wrote a paper. I don't know if you're familiar with Catherine Lacey at all. She wrote like Pew and Autobiography of X. In some ways, her writing reminds me of yours, or vice versa. And with that quote I just read, I mean, yeah, it obviously has religious imagery, but it also has this kind of almost what I would call like post-secularism to it. This like mixture of religious iconography with like urban kind of, you have like parking garages and like gas stations, etc. I don't know, I just am really like fascinated by that kind of defamiliarizing approach. Do you have any writers that you look to that do something like that, or does it just happen organically?
We mentioned briefly like Clarice Lispector earlier, and I think that she does that really well. There's a novel of hers, The Apple in the Dark. I actually read that after I wrote this book, but for the first like third of the novel, it's this guy and he's leaving a house that he was staying in and just like walking into the forest, and as he's walking he kind of forgets everything about his life and what made up his identity, and he sort of goes through this like really extreme process of disassociation and having to kind of rebuild his understanding of the world and his understanding of himself like as he's moving through the forest. And obviously there's like certain things like an apple that he finds or other objects that he runs into through his walk that kind of acquire this like mysticness because he doesn't really understand them in the same way that he would have originally. So I think that she's a writer that does that really well.
Was she one of the gateway drug writers for you, Nour? Or what were some of the gateway drug books or writers that opened your mind or got you really excited about reading and maybe even about writing originally?
Originally, I don't know, Lispector definitely opens up my mind to like how novels can work and how language itself can work. And so she was definitely really key for me. Samantha Schweblin is also an author that I really look up to and that had a lot of influence on Supplication as well. She has one novel, the name is slipping my mind, Fever Dream, that was really influential on this, where it's like quite ambiguous and there's this like real sense of horror and tension there, but there's no way for the reader to trace where this sense of horror tension comes from, and it just kind of seeps into the book like almost organically in a really frightening way. So she was really influential for me as well, and Ingeborg Bachmann as well, as we mentioned earlier.
Well, my dad, who listens to this podcast, will be very excited that you mentioned Fever Dream. I've read it. I love it. He only recommends it to Mike like every time you see him. So, yeah, she's an excellent writer. That makes a lot of sense, like putting it together. I'm very interested in dissociation as an experience. I experience it myself a lot. And I just think it's such an interesting, simultaneously like clinical yet emotional thing to experience and trying to emulate it. Have you ever seen like Under the Skin? I did find that your novel had like a similar, I guess, that kind of urban aimlessness that has these moments of transcendence. And I also thought of Kiyoshi Kurosawa because there's that kind of sense of dread in the ordinary. I was reading an interview with you and Christina Politano wherein you mentioned that you were watching a lot of horror films and reading horror literature as well while you were reading Supplication, or writing Supplication, sorry. And you said, quote, "I think that horror and surrealism can be valuable devices for conveying different ideas to readers because of how viscerally they operate. They provoke visceral, immediate responses in readers, and because of the reactions that people have to horror, it can be a really interesting way of communicating ideas. It really gets down to an emotional / raw level." What kind of horror devices did you use when you wrote Supplication?
I didn't actually know about this until after I was writing the book, but after writing, I read about Salvador Dali's device that he used in a lot of his art that he called the Paranoiac-Critical method, which was something that I was kind of doing with the book a bit without realizing it, where as you're working on a piece of art, you are trying to adopt like a really kind of paranoid perspective and paranoid point of view in order to kind of make connections in your art that you wouldn't have otherwise. I was using that surrealist method a bit while writing and just trying to get into like a really kind of paranoid perspective or point of view, a really obsessive point of view in order to really channel the character really well and get into her perspective really well. Yeah, that was a surrealist device I was kind of using as I was writing.
Well, another device that I noticed used really well, and I love that the word obsession keeps coming up because I am obsessed by narratives about obsession. One of my questions would be if there are any particular narratives of obsession that stand out to you. And then another thing that stood out to me as I was reading the book and as you were talking is this visual motif in the book of images of eyes and mirrors and descriptions of seeing, looking, watching, being watched. You're talking a lot about paranoia and how that functions in the book. So I was just kind of curious to hear your thoughts on how that motif is functioning in the book.
In terms of this motif of being looked at and being stared at, I think like for the protagonist throughout the book, she doesn't really have a really concrete sense of identity or even like where her place in the world is. And she doesn't really want to kind of have a self. You know, she kind of pushes this away from herself in order to have something greater than her that's guiding her instead of having this selfhood. So I think for her, she's like particularly anxious and paranoid around being looked at and being stared at and being kind of seen as a self because she doesn't want that. She wants to be kind of subsumed within something else.
In addition to being a novelist, you're also the editor-in-chief of Maisonneuve. My understanding of Maisonneuve is it's mainly nonfiction. Is that correct?
It is, yeah. I mean, we publish like fiction and poetry as well, but it is mostly kind of long-form journalism.
Do you find that having the role of an editor-in-chief, does it enhance your personal writing practice or does it detract from it? I know sometimes that happens if you work in kind of the creative sector. It can unfortunately sap a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to do a lot of writing or language-based work in general. Like if you're doing a lot of different things at once, that can be like quite difficult. But I do think that editing has made me a lot better of a fiction writer, like even when I'm not working on fiction. I think especially working on kind of journalistic stories where there's like a really clear structure to them. You know, they're very explicit and there's like only certain ways in which long form journalism stories unfold. You have to kind of like learn the tricks of what readers want from the story. And I think that learning how to do that really well and learning what makes a really clear journalistic story has made me a better fiction writer because I can kind of know how to play around with that otherwise.
I've been trying my hand at creative nonfiction, but I do find it somewhat difficult to get. Like, I've read about like the braiding technique and stuff like that, but like, is there a certain je ne sais quoi that makes a piece of creative nonfiction really effective?
I mean, I think there's like a specific blend of, you know, analysis, research, and also personal prose style that really makes a creative nonfiction piece really good. And I think just for us, like as the editor-in-chief of this magazine, guiding stories through so many different editorial rounds and then also like copy editing things, I really get really deep into like what makes a sentence really coherent and like how to make the best and like most clear sentence possible for a reader. And I think that that has been, yeah, really helpful for me.
I really liked something you said in a Toronto Star interview, which was about fiction writing. You said, quote, "I think there's a lot of benefit to be found in approaching subjects from an indirect, slanted kind of way," unquote. I like this idea of slanted writing, and I think that's something that you can do particularly in fiction that might be a little more difficult to apply. I'm sure there are ways it could be applied in nonfiction as well, but what are some of those benefits for you as a writer of taking this slanted approach? And do you see any potential obstacles maybe in that approach?
I think the benefits are, you know, for the reader being able to understand something on a level that's not really like logical and not really conscious, and maybe on a kind of more emotional level, like resonating with the writing on a more emotional level. I think that that is kind of the main benefit of it. In terms of like the obstacles, obviously approaching subjects and approaching writing that way, there's a lot of risk of people not being able to pick up on anything from it and being like really frustrated by it.
In terms of like your own trajectory, do you have a background more in journalism than in creative writing? Like, is creative writing something that you've always been doing? I think I read or heard somewhere that you had started to kind of pursue the creative writing angle a little more recently than journalism. Is that right?
I've always done kind of fiction writing on my own, just like for my own kind of personal practice. And that was kind of my first interest in writing. But for the last several years, like I've worked in journalism, done writing more in that realm. It's only been a couple of years now that I've tried to really professionally pursue a creative writing practice.
Do you feel a conscious shift between the two modes? Like I do find, for instance, I just finished writing my dissertation novel, and now I'm going through the very arduous process of having to write a critical introduction to the novel, which is a very specific kind of nonfiction writing and a very weird one. But I do find there is a conscious cognitive shift between writing fiction and nonfiction. Is it like that for you too?
Yeah, it definitely feels like that at times. And I find it a little bit difficult to switch between the two. Like we just got finished with the Maisonneuve issue at the end of last month, and I was really like deeply in copy editing for a week and really going into every sentence and seeing like when a word was less clear than it needed to be like super clear for readers to understand and like what they expect from magazine journalistic writing. And I find that after I do that for a while and I try to go back to writing fiction, it's like difficult to make that shift between the two, and it takes me a while. So I haven't really been able to do much fiction writing in the last few weeks because of that. It can be a little bit difficult to do that. Like I was saying, there is benefit, and I have learned. I feel that my fiction craft has improved a bit working in journalism, but it is hard to kind of switch between the two modes sometimes, for sure.
I was always told to avoid adverbs, and when I read Supplication, I was so excited by your kind of Baroque use of adverbs. I was like, oh wow, like, I don't know, I just made me feel like I could break rules too. And I just found myself envious. And I was wondering, do you consider yourself to be like a rule breaker when it comes to writing? Are there any writing rules that have stuck with you for better or for worse?
Yeah, I wasn't really thinking of myself that way as much until I sort of saw readers' reactions to it. And yeah, I feel like there's a lot of rules around sentence length and like being as concise as possible that I was breaking there. But I wasn't really thinking of it like that at the time until, seeing readers' reactions to it and hearing people talk about so-called purple prose and stuff like that, where I was kind of like, oh, I guess I was doing that a lot. But yeah, it wasn't my intention.
Well, Nour, I did not think you were using purple prose at all. So
I'm not really sure like what that exactly means anyway.
I hear a lot of writers say, like, I don't read reviews, and I find it difficult to believe. Like, I find my curiosity always gets the better of me. I'm very curious to see what people are writing on Goodreads or Amazon or on blogs. What's your relationship to reader reviews? Are you interested in seeing what people are writing? Is it something you kind of have to keep a healthy distance from? Do you internalize reviews? I know there have been some for me where I'm like much likelier to give credence to a negative review than a positive one. Unfortunately, that just seems like, I don't know, some genetic defect that many writers tend to have. I don't know why that is, but I don't know. What's your relationship to reader reviews?
I don't think that that's like a genetic defect or that it's even specific to writers. I think it's like a really human impulse to want to engage with stuff like that. And yeah, I feel that everyone has it. I also don't believe it when people are like, I don't look at reviews, I don't care about them. And like, obviously everyone does. But I do think that it is important to try and keep a healthy distance from them. Like, I don't think that there's really, for me at least, I just don't really think that there's a lot of benefit to even like looking at how people are reading stuff or what they're saying about it. But yeah, obviously I look at reviews, and I've looked at Goodreads many times. And I find that, yeah, just don't do that. There's no need for a writer to do that.
Yeah,
we all say that, and then we all read them.
Yeah, I mean, I will go back on Goodreads. Yeah, surely.
I feel like every time I go online, there's all kinds of discourse about whether or not people still read and whether or not like, other mediums are overtaking reading and what impact that would have. That might be connected to how I feel about like, the reviews that I'm getting, whether people just are expecting a certain type of high octane novel these days.
Yeah, I think that like the way people are reading over time is definitely like changing as culture changes, like for sure. But I also feel like there's so many different types of readers. I mean, for Goodreads itself, I feel like there's a very specific type of reader that really likes to use Goodreads, and that is like one. But, you know, there is a segment of readers that are really active on social media that complain about things like plotless fiction and these kind of directions that contemporary fiction is taking. But obviously, like this type of book, like the so-called plotless novel or like fiction that's really experimental is also has become really, really popular. Like there's a huge market for it. There's all these publishers that are putting out really interesting, very eccentric work. You know, there are so many different types of readers, and it's really hard to gauge like how people are reading these days just because you don't get to see all of them. And there's like segments of readers that are like extremely vocal and like very online. It can seem like that is how reading culture is, but it is just a very certain segment of how people are reading today.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I don't put too much stock into when I look at a book I'd like to read on Goodreads, what Goodreads users are saying. But I don't know anyone who does. So, yeah.
You were talking about this novel that you're working on now, which sounds like it would require a fair bit of research. Like it sounds like a kind of ambitious undertaking. I was wondering if you outlined this novel or if you're taking a different approach to it than you did with Supplication, or if it's obviously very different in terms of content. It sounds like, is your approach a lot different? Are you taking a new approach this time?
Yeah, very, very different. I did do a lot of research for it. I went to London, I went to Paris, I went to Morocco to kind of do like some in-person research there. And, you know, I feel like Supplication was a very kind of raw undertaking where it was this voice came to me and I was really like pushing through the novel with that as the impetus. But this one is a lot more calm and like in terms of my writing process, and is a lot more structured. Is a lot more laid out. There are actual characters and places and characters with names and like clear personalities that are outlined. So it's like it's extremely different, and the process of writing it has been very different and challenging in a kind of different way. But I feel that, you know, with a novel like Supplication, I don't think I could write something like that again. It was really challenging as a writer, just kind of, you know, especially kind of trying to embody this like really paranoid, obsessive state and channel that for the character. I found like really emotionally challenging as a writer, and it's not a process I would like to emulate again.
That's understandable. And I think I read or heard somewhere that you kind of developed an allergy, so to speak, of horror as a result of Supplication. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, I can't watch horror movies still. Yeah. I used to really enjoy them, but now, yeah, allergic to them.
What are some of your favorite horror movies? I mean, in your past life, what were some of the horror films that kind of left an impact on you?
I think like the number one thing was Possession with Isabella Gianni. It was, yeah, I really, really love that movie. I watched it many times, and it was like also really influential for Supplication as well. Just I feel like it does a really good job of placing you in the character's state of mind and in how she's seeing the world, like at least in the first 2/3 of the movie before it switches to the husband. But I find that the whole kind of metaphysics of the world for the first 2/3 of the movie is really like immersed in how this character sees the world. And it's a really feverish movie to watch, and it really puts you in the emotional state of her as you're watching it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's such an interesting film about desire and like just being on like a dark self-destructive trajectory and like the appeal of that. And that's such an interesting type of protagonist. I don't know, like I do relate to like this kind of fascination with like, for example, a house on fire, like feeling the wrong emotion, or like the so-called wrong emotion at a point in time. It reminded me of writers I love, like I love Shirley Jackson and Mary Gateskill, who I find are really good at looking at psychologically how people can be, by all measures, like wired incorrectly, and yet it's still, I don't know, it's just, I think I'm wired incorrectly, so I often just really relate to them. So yes, Possession, excellent. very formative for me too. I love Isabella Gianni. She's
She's so good in that movie. Yeah.
And I see the connection with your book too, and something you've been talking a lot about is this like highly subjective style. I think that's part of what makes the book so interesting and distinct, is how kind of radically subjective it is. I really liked that element of your approach. Is that something you're bringing to your next project? Is that something you're interested in engaging with again? Or is that maybe part of where the psychologically taxing aspect of the process comes in by inhabiting that subjective approach?
I am still like really interested in that approach, and it does come through in this novel I'm working on as well, where kind of the two protagonists, it's switching back and forth with them through different parts and kind of getting deep into like their kind of psychologies and their emotional connection with each other and with the places that they're living in. But it's not, I feel like there's like a specific subjectivity to supplication where kind of the world around the character is manufactured according to her psychological state, and it's like a very extreme type of subjectivity that is not, I couldn't do that again.
I understand. And I think I read on Twitter, are you working on like several novels at once right now?
Yeah, I'm in a kind of feverish state about it. I don't know why, but I have this this main one that I'm working on, and I have two others that I'm kind of writing snippets of and kind of in the planning stages about, but they're really in the early stages. I just keep getting ideas for projects and then doing a little bit of them and being like, I need to chill and do this later and finish this one I'm working on.
Oh, of course. Are you like mainly drawn to, like, do you write a lot of short fiction, or do you find that like usually your ideas, for better or for worse, demand novel length works?
I think it's like a bit of both. I do really like short fiction as well, and there have been like a few stories that I've written this year that really I'm just like, they need the short story form, and there's no use stretching them further than that. But I like to kind of go back and forth between them. And, as I'm working on a novel and I'm feeling really stuck on it and I just like do not want to do anything else on it, I like to take a little break and like write something a little bit shorter just to kind of, start enjoying writing again in a way, and take myself out of the longer story and have something that I can do like start to finish in just like a couple weeks. And I find that's really satisfying, and it helps me get back into the mood for writing when I'm really stuck on a longer project.
That's very admirable. You must write a lot, like being a managing editor-in-chief of a magazine. It sounds time-consuming. Like, do you have any tips or tricks for like how to make the most of your writing time? Like saying no to social plans, or like how do you make it all happen?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like maybe it looks like I'm doing a lot, but I'm actually not. Like, I'm pretty averse to labor in general, and I do not like to like grind and work really hard, so I'm not actually doing all that, and editing for this magazine, it comes out 4 times a year, and like most of the time it's not really time consuming, so I actually have like a fair amount of time to kind of write without needing to grind. So I don't know. I mean, like I hear from writers all the time who are like, I do my 9 to 5 day job and then I leave and like go and write for 3 hours every day. And I'm just like, I don't understand how you could possibly do that. So yeah, I would like some tips from them as well, but I can't give any.
No, I understand. I mean, Mike and I were both doing creative writing MA. Well, I'm doing MA and PhD just because there aren't a lot of opportunities to get paid even just a little bit to have free time to write. I don't know how someone could possibly write for 3 hours after working 9 to 5. So
Yeah,
it's good to hear that you're not superhuman. It makes me feel better about myself. So good.
Does writing feel laborious to you, or does it feel like fun? Like for me, I think that's part of what I do like about writing is when it's working, it doesn't feel like labor, like it's an escape from that more laborious stuff that gets in the way of writing. How do you feel about that?
I mean, I find it like invigorating a lot of the time, but I do always still feel like it's labor. Like it does feel laborious most of the time. I feel that I'll have ideas in my head and I'll be able to like think about and plan stuff and be like excited by that and not consider that labor. But the act of having a very clear vision in my head for how like a sentence is going to unfold or how a passage is going to unfold, and then like trying to actually put that down on the page and make it work really well is kind of like yeah, it does feel like I'm having to really laboriously pull stuff out, and yeah, it does feel like labor to me.
Do you have like a favorite way of procrastinating while writing? Like I was listening to an interview with Emma Cline, who wrote The Guest, and she was talking about how like sometimes she'll just be like, oh, like for my entire novel, I'll change from like first person to third person, or like I know I like to do things like that, or like just kind of get lost. Like for you especially, like you're so good on a sentence level. It does seem like you probably spend a lot of time on crafting sentences. So if that's the case, how do you get anything done? Or do you just love to like lose yourself in a sentence for like half an afternoon or something like that?
I mean, I do spend a lot of time on sentences, and like that's part of why I think, Supplication was really on the shorter side as a novel, and so is this next book I'm working on. I think like I do just spend like a lot of time on sentences and on paragraphs, and I'll be working for like several weeks and then just have like a page done, and I'll look at it and be like, is that literally it? I feel like it was a lot more. So yeah, I can get really wrapped up in a sentence, and like I find it hard to figure out when something is done, and I feel like I can just be kind of working away at it indefinitely, and will need to like make myself stop and move on to something else.
Do you often work on more than one project at a time, or is this a particularly unique, feverish moment that you're in where you have these various ideas floating around?
Yeah, I think that's like kind of my personality in general, where I'll have a lot of, I'm really good at having ideas, and I'll have a lot of ideas, and I'm less good at like bringing those ideas into reality and like making them really coherent projects. If like left to my own devices, I think I could probably just, have a lot of half-formed ideas that never get anywhere, and I really have to like make myself sit down and flesh them out. I feel like that's like kind of common for a lot of writers as well. So I do have to rein myself in a little bit. And, when I realized a couple weeks ago that I was kind of like half working on 3 different novels at the same time, I'm kind of like, what am I doing right now? Let's get focused. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot of like babies to raise simultaneously. I know this is like an annoying question that some writers hate, but like I'm always curious because I feel like ironically, I'm doing a graduate degree only because I want to kind of get paid a tiny bit to write a novel, but because I do so much coursework, I don't have time to do as much creative writing as I'd like to. And then now it's like go time to come up with some short stories for next semester. But I don't really have like a sense of like I don't get a lot of ideas, I guess. Like I'm great once I have an idea. I love to see it through, but like where do your ideas come from? I know that's a stupid question, but like you said you have a lot of ideas, so I'm curious.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't know. I'm not sure where ideas come from in general. I always feel like it's like kind of magical in a sense, even when I'm like sitting down and writing something, and I have, and then I'll read something over, and it's like, okay, I managed to get this idea down, and like all of these words came out, and I'm always just like, where did they come from? And I don't know, it's just like, it's very magical to me. I don't really understand like where ideas come from in general.
Yeah, no, it's like a kind of alchemical process.
Yes. Yeah, 100%.
It would take a cognitive scientist, I guess that's a question for scientists. But that's cool. I hope that I generate more ideas. I used to have more ideas before school beat me down, but yeah.
Yeah, I think school will do that.
Yeah. Do you have a BA, I presume?
Yeah, I have a BA. I will not do an MA. I mean, like, I feel like I think about it sometimes because everyone like seems to need to think about it, especially like when they get to their like kind of late 20s. It's just like, oh, I should do a master's, but I'm not gonna do that. Everyone I know that's like doing a master's doesn't seem to be like too happy about it.
Oh, definitely. It depends what you do it in. I did a master's in information studies, which was fine because my heart wasn't really in it. But now, I mean, I'm like 34 doing a master's in creative writing, which sounds much nicer, but actually, yeah, it's just you don't have a whole lot of time to actually write. Time is the main thing. You're better off applying for grants or just like working a job you don't, that doesn't suck up too much of your mental energy. I'm always curious about like what writers were reading when they were younger that got them interested in writing. I'm assuming you didn't read Clarice Lispector when you were like 10.
No,
Okay. Did you have any like early like things that always haunted you? Like for example, for myself, like even just reading, I read like I was obsessed with Bluebeard when I was a child, or like, and like only just recently wrote my first Bluebeard piece, which was exciting because I always wanted to use it. Was there like any kind of, I don't know, stories or like even an adolescence that were a gateway to get to Clarice Lispector and Ingeborg Bachmann?
Yeah, like when I was really young, I guess like okay, there is this one book that nobody ever knows what I'm talking about when I mention it, but that I read when I was like a small child, like maybe when I was like 10 or something, that has really stuck with me. It's I don't know like how good it is as literature, but it was called The Adventures of Rat Boy. And it's something like I say to people and like literally no one has ever heard of it. Yeah, I went through my whole life thinking this was like a really popular children's book, up until I started talking to people about it a few years ago, and they're like, what are you talking about? That was, I think, like probably my favorite book when I was a kid. Has nothing to do with Clarice Lispector, but like later when I was a teenager, I was really obsessed with Dostoevsky, and I read all of his works. I'm actually rereading him right now, and he's an amazing writer. I really like how he uses characters as kind of tools to kind of argue these philosophical positions back and forth in really extreme and dramatic ways. Is very entertaining. And yeah, I'm kind of like using it a bit as research for this book that I'm working on, since there are two main characters and they're kind of engaged in philosophical debates through a lot of the novel. So kind of Dostoevsky's helping me with that right now. But I was really, really obsessed with him as a teenager.
I think that we're two more people in your life who have never heard of Adventures of Rat Boy, but I'll definitely look it up for
Yeah, it's a
show
great
notes.
book. I'd recommend it.
I must admit I'm more of like a Tolstoy gal, but like I need to go back to the Brothers Karamazov. I get really discouraged by the Grand Inquisitor. I'm sure a lot of people do that, you know, that like massive chapter in the middle.
Yeah.
But you're like, I don't know, everyone in our lives, Mike, there's like a Dostoevsky renaissance that seems to be going on. And the people around me, it's probably not going on at a higher level than that. But yeah, that's cool that's much cooler than anything I was reading as a teenager. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm reading I'm rereading Karamazov right now, and I actually just got through the Grand Inquisitor like last week sometime. It's great.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is I guess it's like it is a bit of a dense chapter, and I feel like a lot of it is just really immersed in kind of what was going on politically and culturally with Russia at the time, that is just like a little bit inscrutable to us. I feel like some of his works are like that, and also when he goes into kind of the position of the church, and he's like doing these things where he's like clearly commenting on what was going on with Russian Orthodoxy at the time, where it's just like it doesn't really make sense to us, I feel. But I find that a lot of it is applicable to kind of religion in general today as well.
I don't know if there's any actual connection, but as you were describing the novel you're working on, which sounds great, I'm very excited to read it. I thought about the James Baldwin book, Giovanni's Room. Is that an influence at all, or is that a complete?
Yeah, it's not, but you are not the first person to say that. And I showed a friend kind of parts of what I was working on, and she was immediately like, you need to read Giovanni's Room. So I think that I need to do that, since you're the second person to say that.
It's so good. You'll love it. It's so good.
Yeah, I got to pick it up.
It's really good. I can never remember even books I read 2 weeks ago, but I remember being really excited about Giovanni's Room, and yeah, anyways, that's cool. I don't know if I'll ever pick up Adventures of Rat Boy, but I definitely will revisit the Brothers Karamazov. That leads us to, I guess we just have our last question that we always ask. We just like to know, with all of our guests, have you read anything recently that has stood out in some way? Can be like great, can be terrible, though I understand this is a public podcast, so you probably don't want to tell us if something was terrible.
I've been like so immersed in Dostoevsky for so many weeks. I can't even remember what I was reading before that. I guess Jean-Marc Assen's Kilworthy Tanner I read earlier this year, and that's a great book. He has like a very specific and like joyful kind of ecstatic style that is like makes his books like really unlike anything else, and gives this really like, to that novel at least, this atmosphere of like complete debauchery, which is really entertaining.
That sounds really cool. I do love a debaucherous Baroque. I guess debauchery is that what purple prose is? I don't know. But
Yeah.
if it is, then I'm here for it. I don't think it's the same thing. Cool.
Where can our listeners find you?
They can find me on Twitter at Nour Abi-Nakhoul, and that is it, I think. Yeah, that's it.
Before we go, I just want to encourage everyone to buy, read, and review Supplication. It's a fantastic book. Miriam and I both loved it, and to look out for whatever Nour has coming up next. I'm excited to, read your next novel and hopefully the other two that you're writing at the same time.
Yeah.
Or is it 3 that you're writing at the same time?
3.
Yeah, 3.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for enjoying Supplication and for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so
Thanks
much
for coming
Nour.
on.